6 a.m. Tuesday morning, two sheriff's cars in my driveway, Constance Whitfield pointing at me through my kitchen window while I'm drinking coffee in my bathrobe. There he is, officer. The dangerous man threatening our community infrastructure. Infrastructure threats. That's what she called a 63-year-old widower trying to protect the Lakeside cabin where my late wife Martha spent every childhood summer, where we had our first kiss, where she made me promise to never let anyone take it away. 6 months since Martha's funeral, this HOA president has escalated from violation notices to bribery attempts to this. False 911 reports claiming I'm some kind of domestic terrorist. All because I refused to demolish our 1920s family cabin that she considers an eyesore. But here's what Constance doesn't know about the property she's been trying to steal. Martha's family left me legal authority over every power line in Pine Valley County. What would you do to honor your last promise to someone you loved? I'm Dale Hutchinson, 63, recently widowed and still figuring out how to make coffee for one person instead of two. Spent 41 years as Pine Valley County's head electrical supervisor before retiring last spring to take care of Martha during her final months. This cabin has been in her family since 1894. Every summer morning I wake to the sound of loons calling across Mirror Lake, the same calls that made a 5-year-old Martha fall in love with this place. The scent of pine needles mingles with coffee from her grandmother's dented aluminum percolator, the one that still makes the best brew in 3 counties, according to Martha. I run my fingers across these hand-hewn logs, feeling the axe marks her great-grandfather carved when Montana was still territory. Through those wavy glass windows, sunrise paints the same golden patterns that made a 17-year-old girl agree to marry a young electrician who promised to keep the lights on forever. "Promise me you'll keep this place," she whispered from that hospital bed, her hand so small in mine. "It's where our story started." I promised. Didn't realize I'd have to fight a war to keep that promise. Enter Constance Whitfield. Moved here 5 years ago from some gated community outside Denver, bought the biggest waterfront mansion her divorce settlement could afford, and immediately launched herself into local politics like a guided missile seeking status. She's got that ageless quality money can buy. Smooth skin, perfect teeth, hair that defies both gravity and Montana wind. Drives a pearl-white Escalade that costs more than most folks' houses, belongs to every committee that matters, and has never met a charity gala she couldn't chair. At Martha's funeral, my wife's funeral, this woman cornered me by the casseroles. "Dale, I'm so sorry for your loss. Now that Martha's gone, maybe we can finally discuss updating that rustic little cabin to match neighborhood standards." While I'm standing there in my one good suit, still smelling like hospital disinfectant, she's talking property values at my wife's wake. 2 weeks later, certified mail. Notice of violation. Non-conforming structure must be demolished within 30 days. Continued non-compliance will result in $500 daily fines and potential foreclosure proceedings. The cabin that survived the Depression, 3 generations of Montana winters, and a century of family memories was suddenly a health hazard. But here's where Constance made her first mistake. She assumed a grieving widower would roll over and accept defeat. She figured some old electrician wouldn't know how to fight City Hall, wouldn't understand legal documents, wouldn't have the energy to resist. She was wrong on all counts. 41 years climbing power poles teaches you patience, precision, and how to trace problems back to their source. When the lights go out, you don't panic. You methodically follow the lines until you find what's broken. And something about this whole situation felt broken in ways that went deeper than HOA politics. That night, sitting on Martha's dock with a beer and her inheritance papers, I noticed something I'd missed during months of funeral planning and grief fog. The property description mentioned utility easements and mineral rights per territorial grant, 1894. Martha never talked about mineral rights. Her family were homesteaders, not miners. But territorial grants, those were different. Those were agreements between pioneer families and territorial governments, back when survival depended on cooperation and mutual benefit. I decided to dig deeper, not because I enjoy fighting, but because Martha trusted me to protect what her family built, and because some entitled transplant was about to learn that Montana families don't abandon their land without one hell of a fight. The next morning I drove to the county courthouse. Time to find out exactly what Martha's great-grandfather had negotiated when Montana was still wild territory and handshake deals shaped entire counties. Time to discover whether this old electrician had more power than anyone realized. Constance escalated fast, like someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer persistence and social pressure. Within days of my polite refusal, she filed a formal complaint with county code enforcement, claiming my cabin violated setback requirements and posed a fire hazard to surrounding properties. The inspector they sent was Tommy Morrison, some kid fresh out of community college who looked like he'd never seen a building older than his smartphone. He showed up with a tablet, a measuring tape, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong about anything yet. "Mr. Hutchinson, I'll need to document these structural deficiencies for the county record," he announced, photographing my cabin like he was cataloging evidence at a crime scene. But when I pulled the original plat maps from 1985, Tommy's confidence evaporated like morning mist. My cabin predates the HOA by 60 years. It was specifically excluded from all covenants when Lakeside Estates got developed, grandfathered in with full legal protection. I hand-delivered copies to Constance with a polite note explaining her complaint was legally baseless. Her response came within hours. If she couldn't use code enforcement, she'd deploy her secret weapon: social pressure with the veneer of official authority. Blake Whitfield, her 25-year-old son, started appearing every morning at 7 sharp. Kid wore a reflective safety vest, carried a clipboard, and took photographs of my property like he was conducting some kind of professional inspection. I watched him spend 15 minutes trying to measure the distance from my dock to the property line, getting increasingly frustrated when his tape measure wouldn't stay straight in the breeze. Real intimidating stuff. "Ma says I need to document all the violations," Blake informed me one morning, squinting at his clipboard like it contained nuclear launch codes. "What violations would those be, son?" Aesthetic non-compliance and maybe safety stuff. The kid was about as threatening as a mosquito in a windstorm, but his daily presence sent a clear message to the neighborhood. The Whitfield family was watching, documenting, building some kind of case. But while Blake was playing junior inspector, I was conducting my own investigation. 41 years in electrical maintenance teaches you to read property surveys, and something in those inheritance documents kept nagging at me. That phrase about utility easements per Territorial Grant 1894 wasn't standard legal boilerplate. Territorial grants were specific agreements between pioneer families and territorial governments, usually involving land use rights that modern municipalities often forgot existed. I spent an afternoon in the county courthouse basement, digging through filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened since the Carter administration. What I found in those dusty folders made my hands shake. Every power line serving Lakeside Estates, every single wire bringing electricity to Constance's mansion and 47 other homes, crossed land that had been in Martha's family since territorial days. The original easement agreements were dated 1963, with 25-year terms. They should have been renewed in 1988, then again in 2013. According to the paperwork I found, they never were. For over a decade, Pine Valley County had been operating electrical infrastructure on my property without valid legal permission. Technically, they were trespassing every time a repair truck accessed those power lines. That evening, sitting on Martha's dock, I listened to the electrical transformers humming across the lake with new understanding. 41 years of hearing that sound, and tonight it was telling me a story about power, both electrical and political. See, here's something most homeowners don't understand about utility easements. They're contracts between property owners and utility companies, not automatic government rights. When they expire without renewal, the landowner can demand renegotiation or force removal of all infrastructure. The legal principle is simple: your land, your rules. Translation: no valid easement means I could legally shut off their power tomorrow. I called Eddie Kowalski, my old maintenance supervisor who still had access to current utility maps. "Eddie, I need a favor. Can you show me the exact routes for electrical service to Lakeside Estates?" "Sure thing, Dale, but why the sudden interest in distribution maps? You're retired, remember?" "Let's just say I'm considering a second career in property rights education." We arranged to meet the next morning. Coffee, donuts, and blueprints that would show me exactly how much leverage an old electrician could have when someone tried to steal his family's land. Constance thought she was fighting a grieving widower who didn't understand legal paperwork. She was about to discover she'd picked a fight with the guy who knew where every wire ran, every transformer connected, and every switch that could turn her perfect world completely dark. The meeting was set for 8 a.m. Time to find out whether this old dog had learned some new tricks about the power business. Constance's next move was pure political theater. She organized an emergency HOA meeting, packing the community center with her bridge club allies and country club connections. 43 neighbors showed up to hear her describe my cabin as a public safety hazard that threatened everyone's property values. The meeting felt like a town hall trial where I was the only one who didn't get a lawyer. Constance wore her power suit, navy blue with gold buttons that caught the light like warning signals, and spoke with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having her concerns treated as community emergencies. "This ramshackle structure poses clear dangers," she announced, clicking through photos on her laptop. "Outdated electrical systems, questionable structural integrity, and complete disregard for community standards that protect all our investments." The crowd nodded along like a congregation responding to familiar gospel. These were people who'd moved to Pine Valley for the pristine lake views and upscale neighborhood character that Constance's leadership had cultivated. But while they murmured about property values and safety concerns, I was making mental notes about something they took completely for granted. Every person in that room complaining about my dangerous cabin depended on electrical service that crossed my land to reach their homes. The irony was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. After the meeting, I met Eddie Kowalski at Murphy's Diner, where the coffee's been strong and the gossip stronger since 1962. Eddie spread utility maps across the worn Formica table between plates of hash browns and decades of local history. "Dale, this is strange," Eddie said, tracing power lines with his finger. "According to these installation records from the 60s, the main electrical feeds to Lakeside estates all run through property belonging to H. Hutchinson. That's Martha's grandfather, right?" I stared at those blue lines marking transmission routes, distribution networks, and transformer locations. Every kilowatt of electricity powering Constance's war against me flowed through land my wife's family had owned since before Montana became a state. "Eddie, when were these easement agreements last updated?" He pulled out a battered filing system that looked like it had survived several administrations. "Let's see. Original easements signed in 1963, standard 25-year terms, should have been renewed in '88, then again in 2013. His voice faded as he realized what the records were telling us. "Dale, I don't see any renewal paperwork anywhere. According to this, these easements expired in 2003 and were never properly renewed. For almost 20 years, Pine Valley County had been operating critical electrical infrastructure on my property without valid legal permission. Every monthly utility bill those HOA folks paid was based on unauthorized use of land I'd inherited. That night, I sat on Martha's dock watching Constance's mansion blazing with lights across the lake. Her security lighting alone probably consumed more electricity than my entire cabin used in 6 months. Here's something every homeowner should understand about utility easement law. These agreements aren't permanent government entitlements. They're contracts with expiration dates. When easements lapse without renewal, property owners have absolute legal authority to revoke access or renegotiate terms. The principle is simple: your land, your rules. Translation: expired paperwork means I could legally flip a switch and turn their world dark. But I also understood something else about power, the kind that flows through political connections, not just electrical cables. Constance had spent 5 years building relationships with county commissioners, utility board members, and local business leaders. She'd positioned herself as the reasonable voice protecting community interests against disruptive elements. I was about to become Exhibit A for disruptive elements. The next 3 days, I documented everything, photographed every power pole, transformer, and distribution line crossing my property, researched property records, easement histories, and utility installation permits dating back to the Kennedy administration. What I discovered made my retirement planning look completely different. Martha's inheritance included not just the cabin and 40 acres of lakefront property. According to territorial survey records from 1894, her great-grandfather Hiram Hutchinson had negotiated infrastructure access rights for the entire township development, over 8,000 acres of what became Pine Valley County. Every power line, water main, gas pipe, and communication cable serving the county crossed land controlled by Hutchinson family agreements that had never been properly transferred to municipal authority. I wasn't just fighting an HOA violation. I was sitting on legal authority over the infrastructure serving 12,000 residents, 300 businesses, the county courthouse, hospital, and every government building in Pine Valley. Friday morning, I called Jim Bradley, the attorney who'd handled Martha's estate. "Jim, I need you to review some property documents. I think my wife left me more than just a cabin and some grief." "What kind of documents, Dale?" "The kind that might explain why the county's been getting free electricity for 20 years, and why some HOA president thinks she can steal land that's been powering this community since before her grandmother was born." The appointment was set for Monday. By then, I'd know exactly how much power, electrical and legal, this old widower really controlled. Constance's third escalation revealed the kind of desperation that comes when social pressure and political maneuvering aren't working fast enough. She hired Marcus Thornton, a Helena attorney whose billboard ads promised to crush property disputes with aggressive legal action. His demand letter arrived via certified mail, 12 pages of legal intimidation designed to scare a grieving widower into submission. Words like tortious interference, injunctive relief, and criminal trespassing scattered throughout like verbal landmines. But 41 years of dealing with municipal contracts taught me that impressive vocabulary often camouflages weak legal arguments. Sometimes the loudest bark comes from the smallest dog. The letter's basic threat was simple: demolish the cabin voluntarily or face a lawsuit that would cost more than the property was worth. Classic legal extortion wrapped in official letterhead. Meanwhile, Constance organized systematic harassment disguised as community monitoring. Different neighbors drove by my cabin every few hours, photographing everything from my mailbox position to the amount of firewood stacked on my porch. They documented my morning radio volume, the number of vehicles in my driveway, even the times I ran my generator for routine maintenance. Every detail cataloged like evidence in some future prosecution. But the harassment told me something important about Constance's psychology. She genuinely believed that sustained pressure would eventually break my resistance, that some combination of legal threats and social isolation would force me to abandon my rights. She was about to learn that grief doesn't make everyone weaker. Sometimes it makes you discover strength you didn't know existed. Jim Bradley's law office occupied the second floor of Pine Valley's historic merchant building, where the smell of leather-bound legal volumes mixed with decades of client consultations. Jim had handled Martha's estate with the kind of respectful competence that comes from 40 years of small-town practice. He reviewed every document I'd collected: the 1894 territorial grant, expired easement agreements, utility installation permits, and property surveys dating back to the Eisenhower administration. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine amazement as he absorbed the scope of what Martha had inherited from her family. "Dale, do you understand what you're sitting on here?" "Enlighten me, Jim." "Your wife's great-grandfather didn't just homestead 40 acres for a cabin. He negotiated the original infrastructure development contract with Pine Valley Territorial Government. According to these documents, you own utility easement authority for the entire township section, over 8,000 acres. The number hit me like a lightning strike to the spine. 8,000 acres covered most of Pine Valley County, including the commercial district, county buildings, hospital, schools, and every government facility that kept the community running. What does that mean in practical terms? It means every piece of modern infrastructure in this county operates under easement authority your family has controlled for over a century, and nobody's paid you for that privilege in decades." Jim's calculations were staggering. 20 years of expired easement usage across 8,000 acres, serving over 2,000 properties, with current market rates for utility access rights. Conservative estimate: $4.2 million in unauthorized usage fees owed by Pine Valley County. But the legal revelation that changed everything was discovering Constance's own vulnerability. Her mansion sits on land originally sold by Hiram Hutchinson in 1987, with deed restrictions requiring perpetual recognition of Hutchinson family easement authority. Her own property purchase had legally bound her to respect my infrastructure rights. "Here's the beautiful irony," Jim explained, spreading deed documents across his desk. "She's contractually obligated to acknowledge your authority over the utilities that power her entire lifestyle. Her own paperwork proves she can't touch your cabin. The woman trying to demolish my family heritage was legally required to honor my family's contribution to county development." But I was also learning something troubling about myself. The grief that had made me passive for months was transforming into something harder, more focused. Martha's death had left a hole in my world that nothing could fill, but protecting her legacy was giving me purpose that felt almost dangerous. "What's our next move, Jim?" We file formal legal notices asserting your easement authority and demanding immediate renegotiation of all county utility agreements. Give them 30 days to respond before you exercise your legal right to interrupt service. 30 days. The same deadline Constance had given me for cabin demolition. That night, I sat on Martha's dock thinking about power, electrical, legal, and personal. The transformers humming across the lake were telling me a story about control that I'd never understood before. Every light in Constance's mansion, every appliance in every kitchen, every device charging in every bedroom depended on electricity flowing through infrastructure my family had provided access to for over a century. Tomorrow, I'd begin asserting authority that had been mine all along. The question wasn't whether I could fight Constance Whitfield. The question was whether I was prepared for the kind of power that could change everything. Jim Bradley called at dawn Tuesday morning, his voice crackling with the kind of excitement lawyers rarely let themselves display. He'd spent the previous night at the state archives in Helena, cross-referencing my documents with territorial records that existed only in physical form. "Dale, you need to drive up here, now. What I've found changes everything." 3 hours later, I sat in an archive reading room surrounded by leather-bound volumes and manila folders that smelled like Montana history. Jim spread documents across a table scarred by decades of researchers discovering family secrets and property disputes. In 1894, your wife's great-grandfather, Hiram Hutchinson, didn't just negotiate a standard homestead claim, Jim explained, his finger tracing faded ink on territorial survey maps. He contracted with Pine Valley Territorial Government to provide infrastructure development authority for the entire region. The map showed boundaries I couldn't have imagined. Hiram's agreement covered not just the 40 acres where my cabin sat, but authority over utility development across 23,000 acres of what became Pine Valley County. "Jim, that's impossible. One homesteader couldn't control that much territory." Actually, it was common practice. Territorial governments needed pioneers willing to establish infrastructure foundations for future development. They granted resource and access authority to families who committed to long-term regional investment. The documents told an incredible story. Hiram Hutchinson had negotiated permanent utility easement authority for 36 square miles of Pine Valley territory in exchange for establishing the region's first electrical generation and distribution system. My wife's family hadn't just homesteaded land. They'd literally built the foundation for everything that came after. What does this mean legally? It means every power line, water main, gas pipe, and communication cable in Pine Valley County operates under easement authority that legally belongs to you. And the county has been operating that infrastructure without proper agreements for over 20 years. The financial calculations were staggering. Current market rates for utility easements across 23,000 acres calculated over 20 years of expired agreements, $12.8 million in unauthorized usage fees. Pine Valley County owed me more money than they collected in property taxes over 5 years. But the revelation that shattered my understanding of everything was personal, not financial. Martha had known. The woman I'd been married to for 37 years had inherited legal authority over an entire county's infrastructure and never mentioned it. Why wouldn't she tell me, Jim? Maybe she was protecting you from exactly what's happening now. This kind of authority comes with responsibility that could consume your entire life. I stared at those territorial maps, thinking about Martha's quiet strength and the burdens she'd carried without complaint. She'd known that someday I might need this power to protect what her family built, but she'd also known it would change me in ways that might not be healthy. The grief I'd been carrying for months suddenly felt different. Not just loss, but betrayal mixed with understanding. Martha had trusted me to discover this authority only when I was strong enough to handle it responsibly, or desperate enough to use it. What's Constance's legal position now? Non-existent. Her mansion sits on land originally granted by your family, subject to easement obligations that are binding in perpetuity. She can't touch your cabin without violating her own property deed. That afternoon, driving home from Helena, I understood why Martha had made me promise to keep the cabin. It wasn't just about preserving family history or honoring her childhood memories. She was trusting me to protect a legacy of independence that her family had built from Montana wilderness, acre by acre, wire by wire, generation by generation. The question wasn't whether I had authority to fight Constance Whitfield. The question was whether I was prepared to use power that could reshape an entire county. Wednesday morning, I began documenting my inheritance with the methodical precision that 41 years of electrical maintenance had drilled into my bones. Every power line, transformer, and distribution point crossing my property needed photographing, mapping, and legal verification. Eddie Kowalski met me at sunrise with professional electrical testing equipment and survey maps dating back to the 1960s. We spent 3 days tracing every circuit, documenting every connection, creating records that would prove exactly which infrastructure served which properties. "Dale, this is incredible," Eddie said, studying voltage readings from the main transmission lines. "These 3 feeders supply electricity to the entire Lakeside Estates development, plus the county courthouse, hospital, and half the commercial district. 17 major electrical lines crossed my property, 8 water distribution mains, 12 natural gas pipes, plus fiber optic cables carrying internet and phone service to most of Pine Valley County. Each crossing represented thousands of dollars in monthly easement fees that hadn't been paid since 2003. But the planning wasn't just about documentation. It was about strategy. I was fighting an opponent who'd spent 5 years building political connections, social influence, and community authority. Raw legal power wouldn't be enough without careful preparation. Jim Bradley assembled what he called the dream team of property rights law. Sarah Martinez specialized in territorial land grants and had successfully defended homestead authority in 3 states. Robert Smith handled municipal contract disputes and knew every loophole counties used to avoid paying legitimate claims. Most importantly, Dr. Amanda Foster understood federal infrastructure regulations better than most utility executives. She'd written her PhD dissertation on exactly the kind of territorial easement authority I'd inherited. "What you have here is unprecedented in modern property law," Amanda explained over coffee at Murphy's Diner. "Territorial easement authority that was never properly transferred to municipal control. It's like finding a missing amendment to the Constitution." And the legal strategy was straightforward. Assert my family's century-old infrastructure authority through proper legal channels, demand fair compensation for decades of unauthorized usage, and negotiate ongoing easement agreements that recognized Hutchinson family contributions to regional development. But I was also learning something uncomfortable about myself. The passive grief that had consumed me since Martha's death was transforming into something harder, more focused. I was discovering capacity for strategic thinking that felt almost ruthless. The financial calculations were both thrilling and terrifying. Conservative estimates for 20 years of expired easement fees, $8.4 million owed by Pine Valley County. Even aggressive negotiation would likely result in settlement exceeding $3 million. More money than Martha and I had ever dreamed of having. Enough to establish foundations, fund scholarships, and create lasting benefits for the community her family had helped build. Or enough to destroy relationships, reshape local politics, and turn me into the kind of person who wielded power without considering consequences. Frank Martinez from the Pine Valley Gazette was documenting the story with the enthusiasm of a reporter who'd stumbled onto Watergate in a small Montana town. "Dale, this is the biggest David versus Goliath story I've covered in 20 years. One widower challenging an entire county government." The media angle was important because public opinion would shape how county commissioners responded to my legal demands. Frank's articles were framing the conflict as reasonable property owner versus overreaching HOA authority, not wealthy retiree versus struggling municipal budget. My allies were growing beyond legal representation. Mary Santos, the retired county clerk, provided guidance on bureaucratic procedures that hadn't changed since the Carter administration. Tommy Kowalski, Eddie's nephew who worked for the state environmental agency, offered insights on federal land use regulations. Most surprisingly, Dr. Rebecca Smith from the university's environmental law program volunteered pro bono consultation after reading Frank's articles. She'd spent her career studying exactly the kind of territorial authority I'd inherited. "Your family's easement grants are legally bulletproof," Rebecca explained. "Territorial agreements supersede municipal authority because they predate county incorporation by decades." The infrastructure control setup was elegantly simple. I installed a master monitoring system in my basement, completely legal since all the equipment sat on my property. With proper legal documentation, I could interrupt service for maintenance and inspection of utility easements crossing my land. It wasn't sabotage, it was property management. But I was also preparing for the kind of confrontation that could turn ugly fast. County commissioners might claim emergency authority to override my rights. Constance might escalate to criminal complaints or federal agencies. The backup plans covered every possibility. Environmental protection arguments if they tried eminent domain, federal precedent cases if they claimed public necessity, and media strategies if they attempted character assassination. Saturday evening, I sat on Martha's dock calculating exactly how much electricity Constance's mansion consumed monthly. Her outdoor security lighting alone cost more than my cabin's entire annual power bill. Monday morning, she'd discover that every kilowatt depended on permission she'd been trying to destroy. Permission was about to become very expensive. Constance learned about my legal notices through County Commissioner Bradley Voss, who'd been taking her calls about my problematic cabin for months. Instead of recognizing she'd overplayed her hand, she doubled down with the kind of desperation that comes from watching carefully constructed authority crumble. Her solution revealed both her character and her connections. Bribe building inspector Rick Carlson to condemn my cabin before my utility leverage could take effect. I discovered this Thursday afternoon when my security cameras captured their meeting at Pine Valley Country Club. Constance slid a manila envelope across the lunch table while discussing my cabin's urgent safety hazards that required immediate government intervention. She'd forgotten that the country club's own security system records everything for liability protection. Her bribery attempt was documented in high-definition color. Carlson arrived Friday morning for his emergency safety inspection carrying pre-written condemnation paperwork and the kind of official authority that intimidates most property owners into compliance. But I wasn't most property owners, and 41 years of dealing with municipal inspectors had taught me to recognize theater when I saw it. Mr. Hutchinson, I've received complaints about structural deficiencies requiring immediate county intervention, Carlson announced, consulting his clipboard like he was reading nuclear launch codes. His inspection lasted exactly 14 minutes, barely enough time to walk through the cabin once, much less identify legitimate safety problems. I recorded everything on my phone. Carlson refusing to specify which building codes were allegedly violated, his inability to identify the dangerous electrical issues he claimed to see, and his assertion that my septic system, professionally serviced 6 weeks ago, was somehow failing catastrophically. Which electrical code sections are violated, Rick? Well, general safety, non-compliance with current standards. Can you show me the specific hazards? It's obvious to trained professionals. You wouldn't understand the technical aspects. The guy was either completely incompetent or completely corrupt. As it turned out, he was both. While Carlson was fabricating violations, I made a discovery that revealed the beautiful irony of Constance's scheme. His own cabin sits on land requiring electrical service through utility lines crossing my property. The bribed inspector depended on infrastructure controlled by the man he was helping Constance destroy. Dale, you need to see this inspection report, Eddie Kowalski said that afternoon, studying Carlson's electrical violations with the expression of someone examining obvious fraud. He claimed your main service panel is improperly grounded and dangerous to county electrical systems. What's wrong with that assessment? I installed that panel myself in 2019 to specifications that exceed current county requirements. Carlson either doesn't understand basic electrical code or he's fabricating violations for money. Eddie's 43 years of electrical experience versus Carlson's 14-minute inspection. The credibility gap was cosmic. But while I was documenting Carlson's fraudulent inspection, I discovered something that made Constance's bribery scheme even more pathetic. A quick check with the state licensing board revealed that Carlson's electrical inspector certification had expired 18 months ago. He wasn't qualified to evaluate the systems he was condemning. Constance had bribed an unlicensed inspector to file fraudulent reports about infrastructure he wasn't certified to evaluate. The corruption was almost impressively stupid. Jim Bradley filed emergency injunctions against Carlson's condemnation plus formal complaints with the county ethics board and state licensing authority. We had photographic evidence, recorded conversations, and witness testimony proving systematic fraud. But I was also feeling something troubling about my own response to their escalation. The passive grief that had defined me since Martha's death was transforming into something harder, more calculating. I was discovering capacity for strategic ruthlessness that might have worried my late wife. As promised response to Carlson's fake inspection, I conducted my own utility easement maintenance, requiring 6-hour power shutdown to verify electrical safety on infrastructure crossing my property. Completely legal property management, Also, completely devastating to 47 homes that lost electricity from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. on a Saturday when most residents were home. Frank Martinez's expose in the Pine Valley Gazette hit newsstands Monday morning. HOA president bribes inspector in property demolition scheme, complete with security camera photos and documentation of Carlson's expired certifications. The community reaction was swift and brutal. Half the HOA board submitted resignations rather than face association with criminal corruption. Residents who'd supported Constance's campaign realized they'd been following someone who broke laws to eliminate inconvenient neighbors. But I was also noticing something about myself that would have concerned Martha. The power I'd inherited wasn't just legal authority over infrastructure, it was psychological control over people's daily lives. Every time someone flipped a light switch, they were reminded that their comfort depended on my goodwill. That kind of power could change a person in ways that weren't healthy. Constance's final desperate gambit revealed the full extent of her delusion about power and consequences. Tuesday morning, she called 911 claiming I was a dangerous armed extremist threatening community infrastructure after I'd legally conducted scheduled maintenance on utility easements crossing my property. I know exactly what she told the emergency dispatcher because 911 recordings become public record, and Jim Bradley requested copies for our expanding criminal case against her. The audio was both pathetic and terrifying. Constance was hysterical, claiming I was stockpiling weapons, my legally owned hunting rifles locked in a gun safe, and making terrorist threats about shutting down county utilities, which was my documented legal right as property owner. "He's threatening to cut power to the entire county," she screamed into the phone. "This man is dangerous. He's holding families hostage with threats to essential services." She demanded immediate SWAT response for what amounted to a property owner exercising legal authority that predated county government by 70 years. Sheriff Mike Donahue arrived within minutes, accompanied by 2 deputies, and the kind of tactical caution that comes from responding to reports of domestic terrorism. They expected to find an armed standoff or explosive situation. Instead, they found me sitting peacefully on Martha's front porch, reading legal documents and drinking coffee from the ceramic mug she'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I was wearing my old Pine Valley County Utilities polo shirt, the same uniform I'd worn to work for over 4 decades. Hardly the outfit of a dangerous extremist. "Dale, what's this about?" Sheriff Donahue asked, clearly confused by the disconnect between Constance's frantic emergency report and the reality of an elderly widower reviewing property paperwork. "Mike, I'm exercising legal rights that have existed since 1894. Mrs. Whitfield called 911 because she doesn't like the consequences of trying to steal my family's land." The emergency dispatcher, Patricia Williams, had already suspected something was wrong with Constance's report. She'd recognized my name from county emergency contact lists where I'm still registered as the primary consultant for electrical grid problems during natural disasters. Patricia realized Constance had just filed a false terrorism report against the guy who keeps Pine Valley County's power grid functioning during emergencies. Sheriff Donahue reviewed my documentation with the careful attention of someone who'd known me professionally for 15 years. Legal property ownership, territorial easement grants, attorney correspondence, utility maintenance schedules properly filed with county offices. Everything completely legitimate and professionally handled. Then he examined the timeline of Constance's escalating harassment, fraudulent HOA violations, bribery attempts with building inspectors, fake emergency reports, systematic campaign to force me off property my family had owned since territorial days. "Dale, this looks like she's weaponizing every government service available to steal your land, and now she's abusing emergency systems because legal intimidation didn't work." "That's exactly what's happening, Mike, and false emergency reports are serious criminal charges." Sheriff Donahue explained that fraudulent 911 calls carry significant penalties, especially when used to harass neighbors during civil disputes. Constance's hysterical emergency report created felony liability that would compound her existing problems with bribery and filing false government documents. But while we were talking, I noticed something that made the situation even more absurd. The Pine Valley County Sheriff's Department building receives electricity from transmission lines crossing my property. Constance had just tried to use police against the guy who literally kept their station powered. "If what you're telling me about these territorial easements is accurate," Sheriff Donahue said, "this is bigger than a neighborhood dispute. This is about whether county government has been operating essential services on stolen land for decades. That's exactly right, Mike. Tomorrow's emergency county meeting will determine whether they want to negotiate fair compensation or face federal litigation. As the sheriff's cars left my driveway, I felt something troubling about my own emotional response. The passive grief that had consumed me since Martha's death was being replaced by something colder, more calculating. I was discovering that the authority to control other people's basic needs came with psychological changes that might have worried my late wife. Frank Martinez arrived as the deputies were leaving, capturing perfect photographs of me sitting peacefully on my porch while Constance screamed at law enforcement officers from her driveway about their failure to arrest the terrorist. The visual contrast was devastating for her credibility, but it was also revealing something about my own transformation. I was learning to manipulate situations for maximum political advantage. That evening, county commissioners called an emergency session for Wednesday morning to address what they termed the infrastructure crisis threatening county operations. Constance thought Wednesday would be her victory, when political pressure would force commissioners to override my property rights through emergency authority. She was about to discover that some kinds of power can't be legislated away. Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. The Pine Valley County emergency session packed the community center beyond fire code limits. Commissioners, utility executives, legal advisors, Sheriff Donahue, and nearly 300 residents filled every seat with overflow crowds lining the walls. Regional media had positioned cameras to capture what the Helena Independent was calling the biggest property rights showdown in Montana history. Constance approached the podium wearing her most authoritative outfit, a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most residents' monthly income. She'd prepared remarks designed to frame me as a domestic terrorist holding essential services hostage for personal vendettas. This dangerous individual is threatening critical infrastructure that families depend on for basic survival, she declared, her voice carrying across the packed hall with practiced political authority. We cannot allow one bitter extremist to hold our entire community hostage because he's angry about reasonable HOA regulations. Her supporters, mostly transplants from urban areas who'd moved to Pine Valley for the upscale rural lifestyle she'd cultivated, nodded approval. They'd convinced themselves that I was some kind of unhinged mountain man threatening their civilized community. But I'd learned something about timing from 41 years of electrical maintenance. Sometimes the most effective demonstration is the simplest one. Halfway through Constance's speech about threats to public safety, I activated the utility control panel through my smartphone app. Every light in the community center went dark. Air conditioning stopped humming. Her microphone cut to silence. Emergency lighting kicked in as 300 people suddenly experienced exactly what my threats meant in practical terms. Perfect timing, perfect irony. In the eerie glow of emergency lighting, I stood from my seat in the back row. "You want to understand infrastructure control?" I called out, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. "Every kilowatt powering this meeting crosses land that Mrs. Whitfield wants to demolish for property values, the same land my family has provided utility access to for over a century." Jim Bradley activated a battery-powered projector displaying the 1894 territorial grant documents on the wall where everyone could see Hiram Hutchinson's signature authorizing infrastructure development across what became Pine Valley County. As backup generators restored partial power, I walked to the podium with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding absolute legal authority. "For 130 years, my family has provided the foundation that makes this community possible," I said, accepting the microphone from a speechless Constance. "Every business, every home, every government building depends on utility access my ancestors negotiated when this was still frontier territory." Sheriff Donahue stepped forward with evidence folders containing documentation of Constance's escalating criminal behavior, bribery recordings, fraudulent inspection reports, false emergency service calls, systematic harassment designed to steal family property through government abuse. The room's atmosphere shifted as residents realized they'd been supporting someone who'd committed multiple felonies to eliminate an inconvenient neighbor. County Attorney David Richardson read his office's legal analysis. "Mr. Hutchinson's territorial easement authority is valid under federal law and supersedes municipal claims. Pine Valley County has been operating critical infrastructure without proper agreements for over 20 years. The financial revelation that silenced the room came from County Treasurer Rebecca Martinez, Unauthorized utility usage across territorial easements totals approximately $12.8 million in accumulated fees. County budget cannot absorb this liability without emergency tax increases or service elimination. As commissioners absorbed the scope of their legal and financial exposure, Constance desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. She grabbed for the microphone, but I'd selectively restored power to everything except her amplification system. Watching her mouth move silently while gesturing frantically at equipment that wouldn't respond was perfect visual metaphor for powerlessness. District Attorney Patricia Lopez announced the criminal charges that would end Constance's reign. Mrs. Whitfield faces multiple felonies: bribery, fraudulent emergency reports, filing false government documents, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. She could face 7 to 12 years in federal prison. Security cameras captured Constance's complete psychological breakdown as she realized her carefully constructed authority was evaporating. She screamed at commissioners, threatened legal action, demanded they override this insanity while being escorted from the building by federal marshals. The image of her being led away in federal custody while I negotiated infrastructure agreements with county officials would become the defining photograph of what media dubbed the Pine Valley Power War. But as I addressed the crowd for my closing statement, I felt something troubling about my own transformation. The grief-stricken widower, who'd wanted only to preserve Martha's cabin, had become someone capable of strategic ruthlessness that might have concerned my late wife. I don't want to destroy Pine Valley County, I concluded. I want recognition that some families build foundations that benefit entire communities for generations, and I want assurance that no future developer will try to steal what those families protected. The standing ovation felt like vindication, but it also felt like the first step toward becoming someone Martha might not have recognized. The emergency settlement negotiations took 18 hours spread across 3 days, with federal mediators ensuring that both Pine Valley County's budget survival and my family's property rights received fair consideration. The final agreement was more comprehensive than I'd imagined possible. County pays $2.4 million for unauthorized infrastructure usage since 2003, plus monthly easement fees of $12,000 for residential access and $35,000 for commercial and municipal usage. But the most important provision established the Hutchinson Family Infrastructure Trust, ensuring that future utility agreements would honor territorial easement authority while providing sustainable county services. Constance Whitfield was convicted on 4 federal felony counts: bribery, fraudulent emergency reports, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and abuse of government authority. Her sentence, 6 years in federal prison plus lifetime ban from any HOA or municipal leadership position, sent shockwaves through property management communities across 3 states. Her mansion sold at foreclosure auction to pay legal fees and federal restitution. The buyer, ironically, was a young family who appreciated both the lakefront location and the absence of oppressive HOA regulations. Building Inspector Rick Carlson lost his state certification permanently and faced separate federal charges for accepting bribes to falsify safety reports. His conviction resulted in mandatory review of every inspection he'd conducted over 5 years, revealing systematic corruption that affected dozens of property owners. The Lakeside Estates HOA voted unanimously to dissolve rather than face ongoing criminal liability from their former president's actions. Residents established a voluntary neighborhood association focused on community support, environmental protection, and property owner education. But the personal transformation that mattered most was rebuilding my relationship with family I'd neglected during months of grief and conflict. My son David drove up from Billings with his wife and 2 kids, grandchildren I'd barely seen since Martha's funeral. Watching 8-year-old Emma catch her first trout from the same dock where her great-great-great-grandmother had fished as a child felt like healing I hadn't known I needed. "Dad, Mom would be proud of what you did," David said as we watched the kids explore the cabin that would someday be their inheritance. She always said her family built things that lasted. The settlement money funded the Martha Hutchinson Foundation for Property Rights Education, providing legal assistance to residents facing HOA abuse, utility shutoffs, or government overreach. Our first case helped a disabled veteran fight an HOA trying to ban his service dog. Working with environmental groups, we established the Pine Valley Conservation Trust, protecting 3,000 acres of lakefront and mountain habitat from overdevelopment. The trust ensures that future growth respects both natural ecosystems and property rights that predate municipal authority. Martha's cabin has become an unexpected educational center. Monthly workshops teach residents about territorial land grants, utility easement law, HOA regulations, and legal resources for fighting corruption. The Know Your Rights seminars help prevent future exploitation of vulnerable property owners. Frank Martinez's investigative series, Power, Property, and Political Corruption, won a regional journalism award and created awareness of similar infrastructure issues affecting rural communities across the Mountain West. His work prompted legislative review of territorial easement law in 4 states. Most personally meaningful was discovering letters Martha had hidden in her grandmother's hope chest, documents explaining why she'd never told me about the territorial easements. Dale will be a good man with this power because he understands that authority should serve community, not personal ambition, she'd written, but I pray he never needs to use it, because that kind of responsibility changes people in ways that aren't always healthy. She'd been right about the changes. The grief-stricken widower who'd wanted only to preserve family memories had become someone capable of strategic thinking that sometimes worried even me. But sitting on this dock every morning, watching sunrise paint the same golden patterns that made a teenage girl fall in love with a young electrician, I understand what Martha really trusted me to protect. Not just land or legal rights, but the principle that some families build foundations strong enough to support entire communities for generations, and that those contributions deserve recognition, protection, and respect. If you've got your own property rights story, share it below. Sometimes one person's willingness to fight back creates change that helps everyone. And subscribe if you want to see more victories over corruption disguised as authority. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when you're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. Martha would understand.